Welcome to Military History Inside Out, a podcast devoted to the study of how war has been waged across the centuries. Today's interview is with Kimberly Lamay Licursi, who's written Remembering World War I in America, which, as the title tells you, is about how Americans remembered their veterans and their participation in World War I. There's a lot of interesting discussion about movies from the 1920s and 1930s, pulp fiction, memoirs, lots of interesting things, so I hope you enjoy. I'm speaking with Kimberly Lamay Licursi, author of Remembering World War I in America. Thank you for speaking with me.
No, thank you very much.
So tell me about your background in writing and history.
My background in history really came from a fascination with genealogy when I was young, and it kind of grew from there. My writing started just recently when I went back to school to get my doctorate about 9 years ago, and that's when I started writing in earnest. But I originally was in the political and government field.
Oh, okay. Have you always wanted to write a book on this particular subject?
No, it was a subject that sort of became important to me after doing some preliminary research. I never, ever anticipated I'd be writing a book on the First World War.
So tell me about the book then.
Well, the book really comes out of a seminar class I took. And I think like most historians, sometimes what you research depends on what's available in archives. And I was kind of, looking through the archives in New York State and trying to determine what they had. And they had this huge collection of materials that were collected during and after the war for the purposes of creating a memorial book, something that would give credit to those New Yorkers who served and kind of serve as a point of remembrance in the future. And interestingly enough, the book was never published, but they had this huge archive of questionnaires that they had sent to soldiers, information that was collected from all sorts of different war organizations, from the Red Cross to war bond drive organizations. And then from that point, I started to realize, as I got more interested in the First World War, that there was very little written about America in the First World War. You could find, books about Europe, but very little about America. And beyond that, if you went to any bookstore, you would find shelves of books about the Second World War, shelves of books about the Civil War, and a handful at most about the First World War. And so I became quite curious about why this war seems to be forgotten by many Americans.
What's the main theme you explore in the book?
Well, I look at film, I look at fiction, personal narratives, and those histories that were supposed to be created. It wasn't just New York State. Almost three-quarters of the states in the country had tried to collect information to put together these memorial books, and very few succeeded. Maybe 6 or 7 ultimately published books. So I used these war histories, I used fiction, memoirs, and movies to try and determine what memory was out there between, the end of World War I and the beginning of the Second World War, and trying to figure out why that memory never really kind of gained any traction and carried forward into, current day.
So are there any significant secondary issues you explored or developed as you were writing this?
I ended up looking a little bit at a source that many historians, I think, overlook because it's considered pop culture. But I looked at pulp fiction. After the war, there was a huge outpouring of different ways of remembering the war, and one of those was pulp fiction. And, young men would have read these books. Veterans actually were very keen on the books because they found that the stories they told reflected their experiences, and they could sort of relive a little bit of their glory days at war. And so I kind of weave that into my chapter on fiction, looking at how the war is remembered through the pulp magazines of the 1920s and 30s.
That's a huge amount of material there, because I think there were a lot of pulp was put out in that period, like westerns, military, any kind of adventure and all that stuff, I think.
Yeah, and there were about 40 specific titles, on and off throughout the 20s and 30s that focused almost specifically on just the First World War. So it had its own genre even, and most people don't know that there was a World War I genre for the pulp.
So how did, I think those pulps are difficult to find, and a lot of them are collector's items. How were you able to access those?
There was a collection at the Library of Congress, and so I was able to access microfilm versions of those pulp magazines. Yeah, most of the ones that are around, the World War I issues in particular, are scarce, and, if they even are around, I managed to get my hands on a few original copies, but, they pretty much crumble in your hands at this point. So the Library of Congress was really the number one place to access. They have a huge collection of pulp fiction.
What are some of the conclusions or ideas you came up with after finishing the book?
Well, I think in general, there was this sort of feeling of apathy after the war. I think many Americans were tired of it. There had been huge restrictions on freedom of speech during the war. The general attitude was, let's just forget it and move forward. This maybe was a folly in Europe that we should have never gotten into to begin with. So let's see if we can put it behind us. And so very quickly, Americans just kind of tucked it away. Those volumes that I mentioned that the state attempted to put together, they failed because when they went out to these communities to try and get groups of people to go and collect the soldier information, they had a very difficult time getting anybody to agree to do that. And when they did find a small group of dedicated people who would go out and track down these soldier stories, the soldiers themselves basically refused to participate. There's a whole host of reasons why soldiers refused to participate, including the fact that many of them came back and were unemployed. They had, been a huge boom in manufacturing during the war, but soldiers basically came back to an economy in recession, and so many of them were unemployed for long periods of time. They didn't feel they had been compensated enough for their service. And because Americans so quickly forgot the war, nobody wanted to talk about it. Soldiers came back to this population that basically wanted to disregard what they had been through, which to some of them was completely life-altering.
So did, how much of your material dealt with both the, I guess, the bonus army issues and also labor issues at the time, which I'm sure involved veterans to some extent?
I'll only touch briefly on the bonus army because it really doesn't factor into fiction or movies that much, and those are the two areas that I'm really focusing on. Mm-hmm. It does come up in a couple of films in the 1930s. Gold Diggers of 1933 has a reference at the end of the film where it's basically a breadline of veterans who are marching, and they're talking about the soldier being the forgotten man. Mm-hmm. And so I talk about it in that respect. But other than that, it doesn't come up, in the memoirs that I studied, and very little in fiction or movies.
So tell me about some of the films that you came across that you were, I assume you watched through most of these films?
Yeah. There was probably 8 or 9 films that I discussed in the book that had the biggest box office receipts when it came to the First World War. And again, I studied everything from 1918 to 1941. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse was probably the most popular film during the immediate period after the war. It had tremendous ticket sales. It drew in crowds, unbelievable crowds. And it helped to kind of share this memory, but it doesn't touch at all on the American experience at war. It looks almost only at the French and British and German aspects of the war. So it doesn't really relate to any American memory. The first big film that really looks at American memory of the war is The Big Parade in 1925 or 26. It too becomes a blockbuster. It is welcomed by veterans who believe that they have been forgotten until finally by the mid-1920s they're getting a film that tries to look at their experiences. And it does get a whole bunch of attention, but there's no real message that's being sent by the film. The soldiers are fighting, quote-unquote, somewhere in France. It doesn't identify any specific battle or any specific place. The core of the story in some ways is a love story. between two major superstars at the time. So the war scene can get pushed to the back a little bit. It's a great Hollywood movie in that it entertained viewers, but it didn't really present any cohesive view of the war that would kind of stick in collective memory. And then in the 1930s, the end of the 1920s, and into the 1930s, you have a lot of aviation films about the war. In fact, the first film, I think it was the first Academy Award, Wings in 1927 won an Academy Award, which was about the American pilots. Mm-hmm. In the 1940s, right before World War II, you actually get a few films about the First World War because it's almost an anticipation of America going to war again. And Sergeant York becomes an incredibly popular film. Gary Cooper is the lead. He plays this Tennessee soldier who wins the Medal of Honor. He only fights reluctantly after first being a conscientious objector. But he ultimately feels that defeating the Germans is so important that he must do his best. And he ultimately takes a large number of Germans prisoner and brings them back across his line to his commanders, who are astonished at what he's managed to accomplish. But the war, the movie itself, while it is about World War I, it's produced in 1941. It's widely recognized as a film, again, to prepare Americans for this next coming war. And so it's not entirely about the First World War. It is about a country gearing up to once again require men to go and serve their country, and encouraging this sort of patriotic viewpoint that Alvin York, the lead character, ultimately adopts by the time he completes his heroic deeds.
So how many films did you consider as far as including in the book? And then I guess you narrowed it down to 8 or 9, you said.
Yeah, it's difficult because, there's no real mechanism for tracking sales, ticket sales for movies. You can only track really the blockbusters. And so I chose from among those films that were most popular that there were actually some sales figures that they could be tracked. Mm-hmm. Hollywood is notoriously private about their sales figures, particularly in this era. So it wasn't that easy to figure out, which movies were being attended by the most people, and therefore which movies had the best potential to create a memory of the war that was going to be long-lasting. Choosing those blockbusters is really the way to go, and it wasn't a frequent. The First World War was not a frequent topic for Hollywood, so there were only less than 10 to really focus on.
Were you able to delve at all into Hollywood history as far as figuring out what they thought about making World War I movies? What the inner thinking was.
There were a couple of in-depth interviews. King Vidor is the producer for The Big Parade, and ultimately he doesn't really care about the war. He's looking for a vehicle to put on this massive production. He wants to put on a film that's lengthier than had ever been produced before. He's looking at a 2-hour feature, which at the time in the 1920s was unusual. Films were much shorter than that. And so he thought he had to look at something big enough in scope that he could make a film that was that long. And he tossed around a couple of different ideas before landing on the war. So he didn't set out to talk about the war. It just turned out to be a good vehicle for a major Hollywood production. On the other end, the Warner Brothers, they ultimately come to create the film about the First World War because, again, they're focused more about the Second World War. And they're trying to push the United States into war. And that's, a main theme of Sergeant York.
So I'm just fascinated by how much, I guess, the country avoided just dealing with the wars. I forget, do you have the number of Americans who went to war during World War I? Do you have the statistics?
There's about 4 million men who would serve, about 2 million which would actually go across the ocean as part of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe. So quite a few.
So I know that after World War I, the U.S. was still involved in some sort of combat operations, so to speak. There were troops still in Europe trying to maintain the peace. There were issues over in Russia, So I'm wondering if any of that if you came across any of that being discussed, or if that affected any of the memory.
It wasn't front and center in anything that I looked at. It wasn't addressed in the fiction that was best-selling for its time, and it wasn't addressed in the films that I saw. It is part of the reason for this sort of the fact that soldiers, because they took so long to come home, even those that didn't stay to serve in Russia or elsewhere, it took a very long time to bring all of the soldiers back to the United States. So while the first group of soldiers to disembark and port in the United States got parades and a sort of a hearty welcome from people, all of the other soldiers who came after basically found nothing at the port when they came in. And so this sort of long effort to send troops back home results in only a small handful seeing the gratitude perhaps that many of them had expected.
So did you get a feeling there was a lot of resentment among veterans following World War I, or what,
I did sense a lot of resentment. Some of the responses that interviewers would get when they wanted to try and get this information for the state war histories were that, they weren't given any credit for what they did. Nobody had, tried to thank them for their service. The government, could thank them now by helping them get employment, and it's not doing enough to help them get employment. There was concerns that the American public just didn't simply care anymore. They weren't concerned. The war was over. They could care less about the plight of veterans. And for that reason, they weren't willing to kind of play into this, what they considered sort of a game in some ways, to put together this album that would tie up the war nice and neatly as a patriotic endeavor that these men engaged in, when to some extent they were resentful. There's an interesting quote I put in the book where one soldier said, we fought for democracy and you gave us influenza and prohibition.
Yeah.
Definitely some resentment there.
Reading some of the histories of World War I, the public, before the war, their interest or their desire to get into the war seemed to grow, like a crescendo, up till it actually did happen, and I think it seemed like Americans were proud to send the troops over, and then I guess within a year and a half, the war was over, and it sounds like there were some parades, and then America just, forgot about it, almost like they didn't want to, that's it.
Well, I think it was easy for Americans to forget. None of the battlefields were something that they could witness. A lot of the soldiers who died were actually interred in cemeteries in France. The monuments that are created by the American government after the war in France are now cared for by the Battle Monuments Commission. They're lovely, beautiful, peaceful places of remembrance. And Americans never see them because, they're not here in this country. So I think remembrance is tough in this country when there's nothing visual to kind of spur that remembrance on a regular basis. A lot of the memorials that were actually crafted in the United States ended up being utilitarian projects. So they would, create a library or a civic center, and they would use that as the memorial to the First World War veterans. But, shortly after the dedication, people forgot that was what the site was built for, and they don't serve continuously as reminders of the war.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Washington, D.C., they actually, I forget what major road, it might have been Connecticut Avenue, they actually, in D.C., they laid a small stone for every soldier in D.C. who had died, and those stones are now, that seems like it was a grand monument at the time, or a grand gesture, but now they're all gone or grassed over, and it's just, you wouldn't even know that had been done, if you go down this road.
Well, there's a big push, of course, to put a monument on the mall. There is a monument that the citizens of D.C. put up for their specific soldiers, and there was talk for a while about making that the official national monument, but there hasn't been a great deal of recognition.
I know this is outside of the scope of your research, but did you get the sense that in Europe that they perhaps talked about the American participation more than they did here in the U.S.?
No, I don't think they focused on American participation. They focused on their own participation. And, a lot of the people who've written about the war suggest that because there was there wasn't a lot of big-name writers who participated in the war, and there's not literature that was well recognized by a large group of people, that the American experience kind of seems to pale in comparison to some of the major writers who wrote in France and England. It's true and it's not true. One of the chapters of the book discusses the 500 memoirs that actually come out of the war from soldiers who participated. So there's plenty of stories that are told, and reviewers at the time would rate these books highly. It's just that Americans never read them. Americans didn't buy them. They didn't gain any acclaim, so they didn't end up, in large numbers in libraries, and they sort of faded away with the soldiers who wrote them, and haven't withstood the test of time.
So I think one of the more prominent World War I or post-World War I books or series of books came out were by John Dos Passos, I think.
Correct.
I forget the years those were published, but I guess were those not very popular?
I do discuss them in my book. They were relatively successful. I mean, they're not blockbusters for the day, for sure. They did sell to a small group of readers. And you have to remember, there's not a lot of bookstores in the United States at this time. The population of people who would have bought books would have been small. He also was kind of swimming against the tide. Most people wanted to remember the war, if they did, as something that was worthwhile, patriotic, that men should take pride in. And of course, Dos Passos' work was definitely left of center and very critical to a large extent of the war. So that made it difficult for him too.
So you've already mentioned some of the resources you used for your research, the movies, memoirs, that sort of thing. Are there other resources that you haven't mentioned yet?
Well, just the memoirs and fiction. I actually spent some time looking at A Farewell to Arms, which if an American is going to remember one book about the war, that's probably the book that they would remember.
Yeah.
So I spent some time looking into why that book has sort of become the iconic book about the war for most Americans. And it's kind of interesting. People have looked into this, before I did, and they found that academics really took to Hemingway's work, and they would require it as reading to many of their undergrads, and that the book itself doesn't sell the large amount of copies that it ultimately does until the 1950s when it comes out in paperback. So it's not the war generation that made A Farewell to Arms sort of this iconic book that told of their experience. It's sort of academics who praised it as this complex work of literature, and then made it popular by discussing it, writing books about it, and requiring their students to read it in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in the 50s, they sort of, when they read it, they probably considered how it applied to World War II. I'm sure they tried to compare and contrast.
Yeah, I mean, many Americans get the two wars conflated in their minds, so that wasn't a difficult thing to do.
Right, yeah. And I asked that because it seems like it's still, that generation, that post-World War I generation of veterans is still did not get their due, because by the 50s, I guess many of them are still maybe around, but pretty old at this point.
They are. There is some increase in writing about the war in the 60s and 70s. It's almost a time of reflection as some of the veterans are really getting up there in age. Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate to actually meet the last surviving American veteran of the war, Frank Buckles. Mm-hmm. He died in maybe 3 or 4 years ago. He was 115 or 116 years old.
Wow.
And I did get a chance to talk with him, and I kind of threw out my idea about Americans not caring about the war. And he actually said when he came home, nobody ever asked him about it. Not even his family, he said. Nobody was interested in sort of reliving any bit of it through him, and basically tried to forget about it immediately, just like I've sensed in all the other writings that I've been able to access about it.
Interesting. Because I think before World War I, the U.S. always had sort of a negative or apathetic view of the military. The Army was just sort of so distant from Americans, which I think people would be surprised considering how martial a feeling Americans have nowadays, about the military.
Absolutely. And, we have so many people that come out of the First World War that ultimately go on to take prominent roles in the Second World War. I mean, Harry Truman is the captain in the artillery. Marshall, Patton, Eisenhower. These are all guys who kind of, cut their teeth during the First World War.
Did you come across any artifacts or objects that you found interesting from that period?
I did not. Just the books. I mean, there were many communities kind of lower than the state level who actually did memorial volumes. Mm-hmm. And so I have a small collection of those memorial volumes, and it was interesting to see how they decided what information to include and not include, whether or not they used pictures to remember those who had died in the service. There was a general idea that, everybody should be considered American citizens, so there should be no distinction based on ethnicity or race. That sometimes was true and sometimes was not. Mm-hmm. Some communities even used it as an opportunity to shame those who tried to claim conscientious objector status. I was looking at some groups in Kansas, and there was a huge population of Mennonites there who did not serve. And some of these communities actually published their names under a list of people who did not serve as a way of shaming them.
Did you come across any particular civic organizations or any other kind of organizations that tended to want to remember these veterans after the war?
The American Legion was very prominent in trying to put together information to help remember veterans. They tried to collect information from soldiers. They encouraged writing. There was actually a contest, I think it was 1928. The American Legion sponsored a fiction contest to publish what they were going to consider the full account of the war. And they had entries from around the country. Ultimately, their committee decided on 2 finalists, and one of the finalists wrote in a way that was critical to some extent of the war, and the other finalists wrote in a way that presented it as patriotic, justified, and gallant. The committee couldn't come to any decision, so they ultimately awarded the prize to both authors. And those books, the Legion kind of touted as, stories of the war.
So was the Legion made up mostly of veterans, or was it more civilians who hadn't served?
It was all veterans. I mean, these are people that came back from the war and formed these groups at the community level. And there were separate organizations for African Americans. The Legion welcomed anyone who had served to be a part of this group.
And did they get many donations or support from non-veterans then?
I don't think they got a great deal. I remember one American Legion official, he was petitioning Congress for funding to write some of these memorial volumes that were being discussed, and he was having a very difficult time getting the funding, and it doesn't seem like there was any other source that was forthcoming to kind of step into the void. So I don't think there was a great deal of financial support for things like that.
So again, I asked the question because it reinforces this idea I'm getting that it was the veterans themselves who had to take care of remembering what they had been through. It seems like the rest of the United States just kind of, I don't want to say didn't care, but it didn't mean much to them. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't look specifically at the monuments that were created. There are some other authors who have looked specifically at the monuments. And there are monuments in communities, the doughboy, the sort of doughboy standing at attention, that was copied in many communities. And so that was pushed by the American Legion to some extent, or was pushed by community groups. And those still exist. But in general, it's not something that communities really kind of attacked wholeheartedly. It's really the 500 memoirs that the soldiers read themselves and published that serve as their story. They seem a lot more willing to craft their own story than to let the government or others use their information to craft a different narrative.
So what part of the research did you find to be most enjoyable?
I think the Pulp Fiction. I mean, the Pulp Fiction was light. It was meant to be entertaining. It was, in some ways, veterans reminiscing about the aspects of war that weren't as atrocious. The camaraderie that arises among the men, people who become friendly, who never would have met up under any other circumstance. Stealing wine, having French girlfriends, being boarded in French houses and learning a new culture. The hijinks that kind of went on behind the scenes when men were trying to kind of let off steam. Those things were interesting to read about, and certainly some of the gloomier aspects of the war. And it's interesting that many of the writers for the pulp magazines were veterans themselves. And so these were guys who knew what they're talking about. And the readers of these magazines would write into the editor and say, I love your magazine because, what these people are writing about is exactly what I experienced. So they felt that they were fair representations of what they had been through. And there's not a lot of blood or gore or death in these pulp magazines. And again, people who wrote into the editor said, we don't want that. We don't need to relive that part, but we want to relive the positive aspects that we take away from it.
So with that in mind, when they did show war, was it more war in a heroic sense or more in a gritty, dark sense, if there was a generalization?
They were, quick to kind of be critical of anybody who would put themselves out there as a hero or say they were a true patriot. They were more apt to kind of be stories along the lines of, look, we had a duty to the country. We did our job the best we could. We're not heroes, but we managed to basically succeed. The only people that would die in the articles were the Germans. Occasionally another American character would die, but it was mainly a focus on you had a job to do, you went in and did it. There was no glory in it, but you did beat the foe.
What did you find that was most surprising in your research?
I was shocked at how many communities simply refused to participate in some of these memorial books. I mean, state groups would try and coordinate communities, either at the county level or at the city level. And the responses they were getting back were that they couldn't find anyone to volunteer to collect the information. Some cities tried to appoint people, and the people positively refused to associate their names with the effort. And to me, it just acts so much of ingratitude for, what a lot of these men went through, that I found it shocking, especially in light of the fact that the United States is generally credited with winning the war. So these guys should have been given a great deal of credit, and yet they didn't get it.
Yeah. What was the most difficult part to research? Meaning, what were you trying to find answers to possibly and just weren't able to, or were, but only after a great deal of effort?
The most difficult thing was to get the perspective of the soldiers themselves about all of these different efforts to remember, whether it's fiction or movies or the war histories that were being done, to have their opinions about the memories that were being put out there, about the ways that their stories were being told. That was almost like a needle in a haystack, because you have to look for personal letters or diaries. But to pinpoint a personal letter or diary somewhere where it's actually going to make a reference to any of these things became a very difficult thing. Sometimes it was by chance that I come across something. Other times I typically tried to look in particular archives, and I very rarely came away with exactly what I was looking for. Because it wasn't typical that a soldier would, write a letter and say, the state is putting together a war history, and I decided not to participate because of X, Y, and Z. That wasn't necessarily a topic of conversation. So
were many of these memoirs just single copy, handwritten, or typed, or were they published, small runs or something?
Many of them could be small, the length of a brochure in some cases 30 to 40 pages. But the majority of them were actual books of at least 100 pages published by, not self-published, but published by an actual press at the time.
Mm-hmm. Was there any particular press that was trying to put out these memoirs?
During the war, absolutely. They were making a fortune on some of these books. After the war, if you go to read the magazines that catered to publishers, there's a very clear opinion that war books are done. Nobody's going to find them after the war. They're basically a genre that, has gone to the grave. And it's difficult in some cases for writers to find publishers who will actually print their war stories. Publishers actually, write editorials saying, we don't want any more war stories. We're done with the war. We're moving forward. So no, I don't think that they tried to after the war. During the war, and of course during the war, because of all of the restrictions on freedom of speech, the books that were published were all very much supportive of the war effort, presented a picture of the soldier that was one without, death and destruction, and they sold quite well.
I guess most of our discussion has been about efforts at maybe the state or personal level, municipal, state, individuals. What about, have we touched on the federal efforts to, get information or out there?
There were no federal efforts that I'm aware of. There was the nationwide group called the National Association of State War History Organizations, and they would meet. Usually it was a core group of about 16 states that would come together and meet, and they would share information about their success or lack thereof of getting information from different soldiers and trying to publish that information. They met for a few years during the war and then for a few years after the war, but there was no coordinated effort by the federal government itself. It was basically a group of, historians, state historians, historical societies who created this organization on their own. It was funded partially, I believe, by the Carnegie Foundation.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything you discovered that emotionally moved you in some way, either sad or something really that made you happy or that was funny?
Some of the books, some of the memoirs, and some of the fiction in particular. There's a woman who wrote about the war, an American woman named Ellen Lamotte. She wrote a book called The Backwash of War. And the stories that she tells are, they're difficult to read because they are so direct in terms of the impact that the war has had on soldiers. She has one story in particular about a soldier who loses his eyesight, his hearing, he loses his limbs, and when his father comes to see him in the hospital, begs his father to kill him. She really tries to present the real horrific side of war. And her book was banned in this country and in Britain and France for a period of time.
What was her last name again?
Her last name, Ellen Lamotte, Lamotte.
Now, since you mentioned her writing, how many women who participated in the war, American women, I guess there were nurses out there, wrote something?
Right. Probably the most famous memoir from a woman is by a woman named Katherine Mayo. She wrote a book called That Damn Why, referring to the YMCA. She undertook her own independent study to see, I guess there was concern that the Y was profiteering off of soldiers in the field and basically trying to, share Christianity. So she went to do this big study about whether or not that was happening. And in doing so, she ultimately crafted this very long book of all different vignettes of soldier life. And it became popular for a short period of time. She published it in 1920. She becomes famous for other books afterwards. She becomes a better-known author later in life. Mm-hmm. But she's probably one of the ones who sold the most books.
So I guess there weren't that many other memoirs from women then?
Oh, no, there were plenty of memoirs from women. They're women primarily, again, who either were ambulance drivers or were nurses, field nurses, or people who lived in the vicinity of a battlefield. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of people who wrote books in their experience basically living in a house near a battlefield, so they would have, people that would pass by, they would learn of the war directly in that regard. There were women who wrote about fiction, certainly. I mean, Willa Cather, probably the most famous for writing one of ours. Edith Wharton writes The Sun at the Front, and she actually spends a good deal of time in France during the war. I believe she actually takes a trip to the front, too, to learn more about it. Mm-hmm. So there were some women whose stories can acclaim even if they don't serve.
Now, these are American women?
Yes.
Were there any memoirs by black soldiers or participants in the war, American?
I don't know of a lot of memoirs by black soldiers There are a couple of books. One is the official history of the war that focused on African Americans in particular.
Mm-hmm.
There were two Black women who wrote about their experiences in the war as a memoir. And there were some films that were actually created by an African American group, film production company. Unfortunately, there are no reels remaining, so we don't actually know what was on those films. Mm-hmm. But there was a film production company that aimed to use, documentary footage of African American soldiers as part of this effort to, remember what they had done.
Do you recall the name of that company, that studio or production company?
I do have it in my book. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I can find it.
Okay. No, I guess people can just look in the book, though. If I'll definitely look for that. Yeah, actually, I have an interest in movies from the 1920s and film production, so it's interesting that you studied that for this book. But unfortunately, since it sounds like not a lot of World War I films were made at that time, then there's not a whole lot to say about them.
Yeah, there's, All Quiet on the Western Front, but that, of course, isn't really about the American experience, so I did not include that. And I mention it and discuss, the role it played, but it really focused on films that portrayed the American experience because that was the vehicle for American remembrance, really.
So what do you hope the book will do?
Well, I think people don't realize how important the war is to the environment today. The war leads to the creation of the modern Middle East. The carving up of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the war leaves us with, some of the states that are the most troublesome today, from Syria to Iraq, ultimately leading to the creation of the State of Israel. Mm-hmm. The war has tremendous significance. Osama bin Laden, many of his writings would refer to this great humiliation that the Middle Eastern world had experienced during World War I. He saw this as the starting point of many of the great conflicts. So I think Americans should be better aware of what happened during that war because it's so relevant to what's happening today. It not only behooves people to remember the soldiers because they should be remembered for all that they did for the country, but again, because it is so relevant to what's happening in the world today. And hopefully people will pay attention to some of these things. It would be nice if people could go back and look at some of these narratives. Really understand what these soldiers went through. So these books are not bestsellers because they're bad books. They just came about in an era when people weren't prepared to read about this. Maybe this will be sort of a reinvigoration of people's interest in the war. I know there was a huge resurgence of interest in the Civil War, on the centenary. Mm-hmm. Hopefully something similar will happen here.
Yeah. Can you speak to any difficulties you had in getting this book published and how you overcame them?
I didn't really have any difficulties, and I think I was fortunate because of the timing. I think there were many presses that were looking to publish books about the war because of the celebration of the centenary. And I just happened to be lucky in that regard.
Okay, so you didn't time your research at all to hopefully coincide. It just kind of happened that way?
Complete coincidence.
Huh.
Fortunate coincidence for me.
Okay. What's your next writing project?
I'm thinking about a couple of things. I'd like to, if I could, look at a particular remarkable woman from the 20s or 30s, or perhaps a book about many different remarkable women of the 20s and 30s, and not the ones that have already been written about, but remarkable women who have sort of been lost to history, and there are so many of them. Mm-hmm. Elsie Janis is somebody I would cover. She was actually very popular as a entertainment for the soldiers in France during the war. Mm-hmm. But she comes back and ultimately becomes the first female correspondent for NBC. She was widely known during her day and completely forgotten now. But there's a number of other women I'd be interested in focusing on as well.
Okay. Where can people find your work?
The book?
The book, yes. Have you written anything previously?
I have a book chapter in an anthology, but no, nothing. I've written some of the Arcadia series. Have you ever read those Arcadia books, usually about a local community?
No. Actually, yes.
I focused on a small town in northern New York, and I have another Arcadia book coming out in April that is about Franco-Americans in the Champlain Valley. So basically, people of French-Canadian heritage in New York and Vermont.
Okay. So I guess people can find this on Amazon, but any other places on the web they can find your stuff?
I think Amazon is probably the best bet.
Any final thoughts or words?
No, I really do hope that this war starts to get some attention, and that people pay more attention to wars in general. I think the more educated people are about war and the tragedy that comes from it, the less likely it is that we will have tragic wars in the future. I think continually hammering away at this point of what war does to people, about, the consequences for society, the consequences for the people that fight it, the consequences for the family, the better. People should be keeping this at the forefront of their minds to make sure that these kind of things don't happen again.
I agree. All right. Well, thank you.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. More information can be found at warscholar.org.